Well, hello everyone. This is the final lecture that you need to listen to for 8050. This is week 13, the week prior to Thanksgiving. Uh, and so this will be my last lecture, and I'm going to talk a little bit, remind you of something you already know, and that's what's coming up. So I promise this lecture should be relatively brief because I'm not going to go into uh, a great amount of detail about the readings, just enough to set you up for the discussion and the journal. Okay, you saw this slide last week in my lecture, and this is part two of where we are going. I said where we are going, parts 1 and 2. So as you know, just as a reminder, what's going to happen, this is the week before Thanksgiving. Of course, Thanksgiving week is off. There is a graded discussion on week 15. It is suggestions for course improvement. That is not going to require a response or critiques or questions to classmates. I'm just asking you for suggestions for course improvement, but I do want to let you know that it's a mandatory discussion. So that's week 15. So other than that, really, I don't expect you to be doing classwork during the week of Thanksgiving, but of course, if you want to, that's completely up to you. I really am giving you the time, after week 15, after you do the suggestions for course improvement discussion, really the rest of the time is devoted to you refining your term project, which is those two parts. The presentation, which is a PowerPoint with narration that you will post, and then the paper itself, which will be due Wednesday of finals week. And so the other thing, I made an announcement this past week that I have given you now are the evaluation sheets that I want you to use when you evaluate each other. I just want to say that when you post your presentations, you can still read and listen to everybody's presentations, and then make comments back to each other on the discussion board. Those comments won't be graded, and then I'll give each of you a separate email in which I will assign you particular classmates to evaluate, and then you will post those evaluations back to me privately. And so everyone will have an email with the people they're evaluating. You won't know who's evaluating you. I take those into consideration, but let me assure you that I am the person doing the grading of your presentation and your paper. But I want to make this an academic exercise as well, an exercise in evaluating the work of others in an honest way. So that's the reason I do the evaluation. It's not an exercise in peer grading. I just want to make that clear. So let me move on from there to this week's reading and discussion and journal. So I actually decided to put the references right up front today, just to let you know how I'm handling these. There's 4 readings. One is from the box book called Practitioners, which I'm going to refer to at the end briefly. There's 2 readings by Denhart and Denhart, as you can see, and then there's one by Don Kettle. And so let me talk about these readings. I'm going to go into detail on Kettle and the first Denhart reading. Okay, so here's why I gave you this big, thick reading by Donald Kettle, which actually I have to admit is kind of a tough slog. I did have a reason for selecting it though, because what he says he's talking about is big theoretical questions, enduring theoretical ideas, and unanswered theoretical puzzles. So you get the idea this article is about theory, right? And it is about theory. And so some of this stuff that's in this article you have not encountered before. But in fact, much of it we have covered. And there's a lot of other territory that we haven't explored in this course. But what Kettle's really doing is he's talking about the scholarship of public administration, and he's talking about how theory really influences practice. And so even though this article is sort of encyclopedic in its approach, I think this is a really good article actually to hold on to um, for future courses, because what you're going to find is that some of your courses are going to come back to some of these ideas that Kettle summarizes in the article. And you're going to see that some of these theories that he talks about um, are mentioned really in the context of other things such as budgeting and policy. So this article really is kind of part of this continuing attempt to ask, who are we as PA scholars and practitioners? And so, like everybody else who decides to write a summary article, Kettle has some eras of public administration, and he's talking about eras of PA thought. First is the beginnings, and he doesn't actually give it that title in the article, but he's talking about Wilson and Goodnow, which we covered. What we did not cover is what he's talking about, the linkage between public administration and political science. That's actually quite interesting, how public administration and political science were actually joined, and then he uses the word divorced, I think, and then how we have tried to come back together in various ways. But he talks about three eras: the era of scientific management, the era of critical self-examination, and the era of centrifugal forces. So note what he's talking about. This whole era of scientific management, and he's grouping in, Frederick Taylor, Gulick, the Brownlow Committee. We've talked about this era and how Gulick really, and his Posdakorb thinking, really represented what public administration was right up until, World War II. Then we enter this era of critical self-examination, and we've read some of these articles. We've looked at Simon briefly. We looked at Dahl. We've looked at Waldo. And so what was happening during this era is this rejection of principles-based theorizing. And Simon's article is real important here, because what Simon does, and Kettle mentions this, is that, we kind of move from thinking about public organizations as analyzing the organization as the critical problem to analyzing decision making in the organization as the critical problem. And so we see this in organizations, this rise of behavioralism, where we're actually looking inside the organization and we're trying to figure out what makes the people in the organization tick. And in this period too, you might throw in this idea of new public administration that came about from the Middleburg Conference, in the late 60s, and how those scholars wanted public administration really to move away from this talk of institutions and bureaucracies to actually talking about the problem itself. I mean, what is the public problem that the organization is supposed to be addressing? Not what is the organization and how should we design it? And then Kettle talks about this era of centrifugal forces. So what's he talking about here? And we're going to talk about some of this, but we actually have talked about this, that there's this lack of clear focus. And this is the era where we have these battles between, what is new public management versus new public administration. Should public administration be focused more on public management or public administration or public leadership? And so we have this era where scholars are really arguing with each other about what is the constitution of public administration. And so this part of the article I think is really important to kind of wrap your heads around, and that is, what Kettle's talking about here is four sort of historic traditions in American public administration. So he's talking about the Madisonian tradition, the Hamiltonian tradition, the Jeffersonian tradition, and the Wilsonian tradition. So we haven't really thrown Wilson in with Madison, Hamilton, and Jefferson yet, but there's a reason he does this. So as we know, and as we've talked about, this Madisonian tradition is this idea of balance of power, right? Ambition counteracts ambition. And so from that, we get the idea of pluralism and even interest group pluralism. And a lot of people talk about interest groups, balancing interest groups as sort of a reflection of Madisonian ideas. And then we talk about the Hamilton tradition of the strong executive and a strong central government. And we covered this several weeks back, where we talked about, was Hamilton really more interested in a strong central government? And I think we noted that Hamilton probably did lean that way. And so Hamilton's idea was that the executive should be strong and that the central government should be stronger, certainly than a lot of people in the constitutional era thought. And then, in contrast and in conflict really to the Hamiltonian tradition is the Jeffersonian tradition, where Jefferson promoted a small government. He saw an agrarian-based United States where local government was preeminent. And then there's the Wilsonian tradition, which we really started with several weeks ago, because Wilson talked about a strong, neutral administration committed to carrying out the political will. Whatever that political will was, the idea was that government worked best when we had a neutral, professional administration. And so there's, on page 17 of the Kettle article, he has this chart. And what's he talking about here? Well, so if you look on the left side, what he's really doing is he's making a continuum between the Hamiltonian tradition and the Jeffersonian tradition, right? So really, Hamiltonian thinking concerns a strong executive and top-down government. Jeffersonian thinking concerns a weak executive with bottom-up government. So he places those in contrast. And then at the top, he places the Wilsonian tradition and the Madisonian tradition in contrast. So in the Wilsonian tradition, we're talking about a very hierarchical government, right? The government, the elected government makes the policy, the administrators implement the policy. It's that hierarchy. The Madisonian tradition is talking about really more of a balance of power, even between administration and politics. And so then what happens if you put these in a 2x2 matrix and you try to see how in our country where we don't have just one kind of tradition of thought about our political institutions or our administrative institutions, what happens when you put them together? So, the strongest kind of government, in a sense, the strongest executive at least, would be where Hamiltonian and Wilsonian traditions are combined. So you have a strong executive with top-down accountability and hierarchical authority, right? But what if you have a Jeffersonian kind of idea with a Wilsonian hierarchy? Well, you'd have a weak executive, and you'd have bottom-up accountability with responsiveness to citizens. It's not that there's no accountability; it just kind of works differently. And so you can see how if you carry this out to every 4x4 quadrant in this matrix, you can see how the combination of these thoughts work together. So what I'd like you to do at this point, as I'm giving you this lecture, go back to the Kettle reading where he talks about this and sort of wrap your minds around what he's talking about, how these theories come together. This slide I'm not going to dwell on for very long at all, but what I want you to do, and you're going to have to probably read this a couple times because there's some stuff in here in the Kettle article that we really did not talk about. And actually, to tell you the truth, the way the article's arranged, I think I wouldn't have thrown this whole section on theories right in the middle of it. It seems a little bit misplaced, in my opinion. But be that as it may, the importance of this slide and the importance of what Kettle's doing in this article is he's talking about a lot of theoretical stances that scholars have taken to describe the way public administration works and how bureaucracies and institutions work. And so he talks about the principal agent theory. He talks about bureaucratic politics theory. He talks about institutional choice and public choice theories. He talks about networks and governance, and he talks about reinvention and the National Performance Review. Okay, so what's really interesting there is that Kettle points out, in his opinion, that there's a difference between reinvention and the National Performance Review, and even NPM, which most people would sort of group together. And so I'm putting this slide out there to encourage you to read what Kettle has to say about these theoretical claims on institutions, and understand then that the way we carry out public administration really is grounded in a lot of these theories, right? So if you believe, if you think that people respond in sort of a public choice manner, that is, that most people are profit maximizers and are self-interested, then what you will believe is that we should run government more like a business, because what the citizen wants is the very best service he or she can get as a customer. The citizen has no regard necessarily in this kind of theoretical stance for the common good, if there is such a thing. They're just interested in what the government is supposed to deliver to them. And you can actually extend that theory and say that, yes, then bureaucracies are also self-interested. Politicians are self-interested. And so how do we maximize benefit for everyone given all this self-interested behavior? And so you can see then how these theories translate into these ideas of how administration should work. And we're going to talk about this in just the next slide or two when we contrast this idea of new public management and new public service. So this is the Denhart and Denhart article of 2000. So let me stop right here and tell you I gave you two articles by Denhart and Denhart. The later article really is, it's not a recap of this article, but what they're doing in the second article is they're pointing out some research that has been done that, in their opinion, speaks to the validity of their idea of new public service. Because they say at the outset, and they admit for both new public management and new public service, that both of these ideas, if you will, are actually normative. They're not empirical ideas, they're normative ideas, how things should be, and they're in conflict. But that second article is an attempt to point to some of the research that validates their idea of new public service. So what do they have to say about new public management versus new public service? Well, I'll also tell you that, in the article of 2000, they say they're talking about new public management, but some of the things they quote, they're actually talking about reinventing government. So, new public management and reinventing government have slightly different stances. I mean, they emphasize different things. And Denhart and Denhart sort of seem to lump up new public management and reinventing together. But be that as it may, they use this article to contrast their idea with new public management. So the first thing is that there's a difference in the starting point, right? So is government an enterprise in which managers should strive for efficiency? That's what... If you ask that question and you say yes, then new public management would kind of point you in the direction of efficiency. Or is government an extension of all citizens? And if you answer that question yes, then you realize that if government is an extension of all citizens, it's really not a business. It's an enterprise in which we all have interest and skin in the game, if you will. And so there's a difference in how you treat the citizen, right? The second question that Denhart and Denhart throw out there is they're really asking, is this idea of old public administration a straw man, or is it a setup in a sense? And what they're doing here is they're critiquing new public management, because they say that new public management uses this idea of whatever old public administration is as this sort of straw man that they can tear down with NPM. And so what is old public administration? So they come up with these several characteristics of old public administration, and that would involve neutral competence. It would involve direct delivery of services through a centralized bureaucracy, top-down implementation of programs, closed bureaucracies that limit citizen involvement, efficiency and rationality as the most important values, administrators who don't play a policy role at all, they just implement, and this idea of pos to core management. And so what they say is that yes, of course, if that's what new public management is opposed to, then of course new public management wins every time. But in fact, they say that there has been a lot of progress in public administration, and that new public management unfairly characterizes all of public administration in this way. And so, in the sense that both of these are normative theories, here are sort of the proverbs of each, if you will. As we recall, Simon called what Gulick wrote the proverbs of administration. And in a sense, new public management and new public service both kind of have their own proverbs, right? So new public management in reinventing government has these 9 or 10 kind of admonitions that they say government should adhere to. So steering rather than rowing, empowering rather than serving, replacing bureaucracy with market processes, transforming these rules-driven organizations, results-oriented government, meeting needs of customers, not the bureaucracy, and on and on. A new public service then, because it proceeds from a different basis, has these kinds of ideas for public servants. We should serve rather than steer. That public interest is the aim, not the byproduct. That we should think strategically and act democratically. That we should serve citizens, not customers. And that the last one, that we value citizenship and public service above entrepreneurialism. So the really big difference in what they're saying is that the citizen is involved in government by definition. That the citizen is not a customer. And so this is kind of an important distinction, right? If I live in my house and I have a giant pothole in front of my house on the street, am I a citizen or am I a customer that just needs to call the pothole repair line and complain that the pothole's not being repaired? Or am I embedded in the process and I think about, the whole community and whether my pothole is worse than somebody else's, or the other things that government has to do? And so it's really a difference in how we view the human that's involved as citizen. So where does that leave us? And I promised this lecture would be short. I'm already over 20 minutes, so I'm trying to wrap this up. In a sense, it leaves us with this box reading that I assigned you at 5.3, that is called Practitioners. It's a pretty short article, but it's important. So who are we as public service practitioners? And this is a good way to wrap up our journey through this semester, I think. What motivates us? Who do we serve? And how do we categorize those whom we serve? Can we be neutral? Is legitimacy important? Is problem solving more important? And then, are we helpers or implementers or controllers? These are these roles that Box talks about on page 246. And when people rail against government that doesn't work, are they talking about elected officials or public service practitioners or both? Does the level of citizen involvement required for new public service exist? Or is it more appropriate just to think of citizens as customers who really don't care about ownership of government? They just want their pothole fixed. And so this is how we're wrapping up week 13 here. And as I do this, I just want to tell you that it's been great, honestly, reading the journal postings that you guys have made, and also the discussions that you have engaged in with each other. I just think your level of interaction with each other has just been exemplary, really, as far as I'm concerned. And I'm very, very happy with the way you have responded to each other in the discussion boards. I just think that we've all learned a lot from what has been posted and the questions that you've asked each other and the critiques you've offered each other. So thanks for that. So this week, I posted the Week 13 journal last week in Week 12, so hopefully you've already seen it. But what I want you to do is I want you to reflect on public administration, the future of public administration. And to me, the future is right now until around 2030. I mean, I don't know what happens after that. I could go out later, I suppose, to 2100 or something like that. But I think that time horizon of about 15 years is pretty appropriate. And I want you to think about, how will we administer public policy in the future, and what will be the relationships between sectors. And then in this week's discussion, I'm bringing it back to the box reading, but only in the sense that I'm using that to set it up in his discussion of roles. Based on all the reading that we've done, how would you now describe the role of public service practitioners? So these are kind of related. These questions are kind of related, but one is more future looking. So I'm again looking forward to your discussions and your journals. And this is the last week we'll be doing this. We'll be moving on to finishing term projects after that. So thanks again for listening. I'm looking forward to what you have to say.